So, Freedom Week's kicking off mid to late September, beginning with Ben Shapiro at UC Berkeley, Ann Coulter, Milo Yiannopoulos, several of the speakers that were either banned or had their events shut down due to violence. That's all kicking off in mid to late September. So that got me thinking that the events of the last few years here in America, we've noticed a huge uptick in the amount of rioting and violence. Um, so it's not really too off the mark to say that things like that could potentially start a second American Civil War. So what I'm going to be talking about here is a hypothetical second American Civil War. And in order to do that, we really need to go back to the first Civil War. Now, in the first Civil War, of course, between 1861 and 1865, there were between 650,000 and 700,000 dead soldiers. That's just soldiers alone. There were approximately 50,000 civilians and approximately 80,000 slaves dead as a result of the war. So you're looking at a number between 785,000 to 1 million dead. Now, in 1860, the total population, according to the U.S. Bureau of Census, was 31,443,321. So if you go with a high-end death toll of the Civil War being a million, that means that about 1 out of every 30 people died in the Civil War in the United States. If we were to use today's population of 308,700,000 and totally disregard any kind of massive military technological leaps, let's say it's still muskets and cannons, just keep the numbers and keep the same formula that was applied, that would be 1 out of every 3 people dying. Then the number jumps from 1 million people to 10 million people. Of course, the U.S. military has gotten much more advanced. This being the case, it actually would be hoped for that surgical strikes and things of that nature would lower the number instead of making it much larger by what I think would be a hugely significant amount. However, that's assuming a great many things, and so before we can go into that, we need to look at where we are now and what a second Civil War would mean for America. First, the Civil War was a war with actual boundaries and battle lines that were very clearly marked. The Confederacy consisted of the states of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Now, both Kentucky and Missouri have stars on the Confederate flag and the American flag, although neither state voted to secede. In Kentucky's case, it was claimed neutrality from the outset and warned both the Union and the Confederacy alike that any movement of troops into Kentucky's boundaries would be considered an invasion and would be treated accordingly. Now, on September 4th, 1861, Confederate General Leonidas Polk violated that neutrality by ordering Brigadier General Gideon Johnson Pillow to take Columbus, Kentucky, which was a very strategic area due to the terminus of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and its position on the Mississippi River on the bluffs that overlook the town. Polk did that, and he built Fort DeRossi on those bluffs, and they were able to see directly over the Mississippi River, and it gave them, a very strategic advantage. Directly after that, on September 6, 1861, then Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, took Paducah, Kentucky, in response to the Confederate move. Now, you have to bear in mind that Fort DeRossi was called the Gibraltar of the West by the Confederacy, so it was seen as a very big deal. At the outset, Kentucky called for both armies to be labeled as invaders and ordered both armies to leave Kentucky's territory. After some political wrangling, the governor of Kentucky at the time, Governor McGoffin, ordered that only the Confederate Army should leave and that the flag of the United States to be raised over the Capitol in Frankfort, declaring its allegiance to the Union. this did not stop Confederate and Union troops alike from raising in Kentucky. There were literally brother versus brother. It became a daily occurrence. Of Kentucky's 110 counties, 68 delegates met and formed a Confederate shadow government for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Both presidents of the Civil War were born in Kentucky. There's a lot about the original Civil War that features around Kentucky. Lincoln was famed to have said, "If we lose Kentucky, we've lost the war." Like Kentucky, Missouri voted against secession 89-1 on March 19, 1861, but again a shadow government was formed for the Confederacy. However, the Confederates were never able to really control Missouri and wound up pretty much a government in exile in Texas for the majority of the war. Kentucky and Missouri are both considered border states, but are the only two with stars on both the Union and Confederate flags, and both the Union and Confederacy laying claim to them. Other border states, like, there was Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia. These were all slave states, but they were not in rebellion, and as such, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation didn't really apply to them. They all remained within the Union, so even though they were slave-holding states, they were not in revolt, and so the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to them, and they kept their slaves right straight up to the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. Now, I know that's kind of a bit long-winded, but there's a reason for this little history lesson. I'll be coming back to the border states, more especially Kentucky and Missouri, again in a bit as they play a role in this little hypothetical thesis I've got going on here. But one can see very clearly on the map the battle lines of the Civil War. It's clear that there were two separate nations at war, and where one ended and the other began, you can see a clear line of demarcation. Thus we enter our first and true problem of the Second American Civil War. The battle lines for that war would look something like this. But, in fact, truly, the Second Civil War has begun in my hypothetical here in all these places that you see marked with explosions on this map. Each one of these explosions that you see represented on this map has resulted from a protest that turned violent and either turned into a riot and led to Americans hurting, if not killing, other Americans. Now, once UC Berkeley, later on in September, allows Ben Shapiro on the 14th at Zillerback Hall to come in, and this is at the behest of the Berkeley College Republicans. And also, UC Berkeley is charging them $15,000 security fee, which seems like something that taxation and tuition should have taken care of by itself. But, it's been paid, so they've cleared that path. But when this happens, and like I said, it'll begin with Ben Shapiro, and then later on in the month, it's supposed to be Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos. There'll be a lot of people, a lot of conservatives there speaking. What I think is going to happen here, anybody that's not been living with Jeremiah Johnson has got to see that UC Berkeley has become an epicenter for Antifa versus conservatives and the alt-right for quite some time now. Free speech has kind of become a cudgel with which both sides hammer each other. Antifa believes that free speech does not include hate speech, despite being told by the Supreme Court of the United States that it most unequivocally does. As long as that hate speech does not incite direct violence, neo-Nazis, the KKK, white nationalists, you name it, they have every right to peacefully assemble and say whatever vitriolic, heinous things they want to. It's stupid and it's disgusting, yes, but regardless, it's not only legal, it's constitutionally protected. Antifa does not like this fact a bit. However, instead of I don't know, elect enough members of government to get a quorum going to where they could put some sort of constitutional amendment to the First Amendment. They've taken to disrupting the events with violence and calling everyone that disagrees with them a Nazi, which in their eyes gives them kind of a justification for physically attacking those people. And then they wonder why the numbers of people are flocking to the alt-right here lately. Calling someone a Nazi over and over again only works until that person says, fuck it, fine, I'm a Nazi, now what? At this point, conversation ends and it's straightforward violence from there on. Personally, one of my favorite things about the First Amendment is that it allows me to see exactly where the cancer in our society can be found. So I really encourage it that way. I know exactly where the idiots are, so I can hear them speak and go, oh, yep, there are some idiots. But I'm just one guy. So with these upcoming freedom of speech events at Berkeley getting ready to kick off in just a few days, the security for the event has been just going through the roof. After they saw what happened with Boston, when they saw what happened, of course, definitely Charlottesville. With Charlottesville, it was a totally different story. They don't think they were really prepared for what happened there. With Boston, they were more than prepared. I've done other videos on that. But Berkeley, they're ready to roll, or appear to be. Let's put it that way. They're barricading off all the areas, and if you're not a ticket holder, you're not getting in. There's going to be a very high and increased visible police presence. And they've published a list of prohibited items. An email from the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost Paul Alveolos. I've said that name horribly, I'm sure. Alvesatos. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, sir. He said in an email in part that they would be, quote, strictly enforcing the laws and policies regarding individuals wearing masks and carrying weapons of any sort, end quote. Now, masks and weapons, if they can't wear masks and carry weapons, it's going to be kind of hard to follow through with the kind of thing that happened last February when Milo Yiannopoulos tried to speak there and the law enforcement was ordered to stand down and millions of dollars of property damage was caused and several people were assaulted. Will it work this time with police on the streets in mass numbers? Who knows? In this hypothetical, getting back in a roundabout way to how the border states in the Civil War, they are kind of indicative of a second Civil War. Let's imagine that the free speech events in mid to late September go very, very badly. Imagine they become incredibly violent and law enforcement are forced to fire into them, killing several. Now, this is a worst case scenario to be sure, but it is possible. Antifa nationwide would become galvanized, and cries of "Remember Berkeley" would soon be heard en masse as chaos erupts across all the major cities. The alt-right would be using this as a catalyst. They would come out in force as well, and cities both large and small would soon become battlegrounds. Suddenly, every state would be a border state with two armies at war until the entrance of either state's federal or state military units. Then things would get really, really interesting. Now, the first thing I think that would happen would be called from the state governors for a state of emergency in their respective states. This will allow for Title 32 National Guard usage as a bolster to local law enforcement. The Posse Comitatus Act, signed into law on June 18, 1878, makes it illegal to use the U.S. Army, and then later amended for the Air Force, from being used as a law enforcement body. Now, there's no specific wording in that act that includes the U.S. Navy or Marine Corps. However, the Department of Navy has enacted regulations on its own that give that act respect for both of those forces as well. So the Navy's not going to be brought in. The Marines wouldn't be brought in under Posse Comitatus. The U.S. Coast Guard is not under the Posse Comitatus law, but I can't really see in this scenario how they would come into play. So when one sees American service members being used as law enforcement, then you're always seeing the National Guard. If they're legally being used, those are only National Guard units. Now, in this hypothetical Second Civil War, the line between Antifa and its affiliate groups and the alt-right and their affiliate groups would become blurred pretty quickly, as we've seen it do in the past when both sides are given a perceived common enemy, which is the law enforcement. Should the law enforcement be the National Guard and fire is exchanged, you would then have a large group of heretofore unheard from groups pop up, these being the conspiracy hive-minded of America becoming a dictatorship bunch. The 10 full hat wearing were, 1 inch away from having everything stripped away. These heavily armed and heavily supplied groups, many of whom have actually been looking forward to this day, would begin to have a systemic set of guerrilla attacks on these National Guard forces. Now, these modern-day Brutuses, thinking they're saving the Republic from Caesar, will only cause more problems. If enough of them cause enough damage, the president can, by precedent, suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Posse comitatus goes right out the window. And the next thing you know, you have regular American military forces being used to quell what is basically an insurrection. Now you get a full-scale military action on U.S. soil, which brings us back to a point shared with the First Civil War. Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's greatest general, was abjectly torn apart about his duty as a soldier. At one point, he was actually offered command of the Union's forces. This decision is recorded. His decision is recorded in history. But having read the letter of resignation that he himself wrote and numerous of accounts from that time, that decision was the most painful of his entire life. And this will happen at some point to almost every American service member called into action that involves the possible killing of American citizens on American soil. None of them joined with that intent. Will they follow orders and kill their fellow citizens, or won't they? Now, this can go one of only two ways. If there's no dissension in the ranks and all the service members follow the orders that are given to them, this will be one very, very short civil war. All of Antifa, the alt-right, every militia, and every prepper combined stand no chance in an outright war with the U.S. military. Of course, guerrilla warfare could prolong it, but the aftermath of one sizable battle would probably have enough to have all parties surrendering en masse. You just simply cannot hope to win a war with an assault rifle against the combined arms of air support, artillery, armor, and a never-ending resupply, no matter how good a shot you are. However, in this particular hypothetical, let's say it occurs as it did in 1861. Some troops refuse, by entire units, to kill Americans and instead join them. But join whom? As I pointed out at the beginning, there are no clear lines of battle. So, an armored division under an alt-right flag fighting an armored division under an Antifa flag? That's never going to happen. Much more likely would be basically a state-level loyalty, which would end, I guess, with the Second Civil War ending with 50 small countries all facing off against each other, or more likely probably several states banding together in local areas, a la the 13 original colonies, for mutual aid and defense. So what happens then at that point? Is that the end of the United States? If the hypothetical second option of the military revolt, most certainly, the U.S. will cease to be as a federal body. However, I don't think so, for the reason that most people would think. The U.S. is so wrapped up in our own little cocoon, we don't see the huge impact we have on a global scale. A second civil war in America means an end of force projection of our military worldwide, and other countries would rush in to fill that vacuum. I think this could result in World War III. In my opinion, local skirmishes would grow into larger conflicts. Look, all it took for World War I to get started was a teenage member of the Black Hand to fire one pistol at Franz Ferdinand. And while on the subject of the global stage, do you not think the rest of the world's going to be awfully worried about who retains control of America's nuclear arsenal? Worried enough to invade us themselves or even launch a preemptive nuclear strike to disable us as a threat? I know that sounds a bit far-fetched living in the world we are living in now, but if we were 50 small countries, each nuclear capable, or even say we, like I said before, we became small city-states within what used to be the United States, we'd still be nuclear capable. And what you wind up having there is, well, look at North Korea, multiply that by about 4,000 times, and you'd get an idea how worried the rest of the planet would be. It's all been hypothetical, of course, and it's been vastly oversimplified for time. There are literally thousands of different aspects I don't have time to cover. But what I can say about this hypothetical second civil war is this. Regardless of how much we may feel divided right now, we come nowhere near as divided as we were in 1861. And if there's one lesson from that bloody 4-year war of brother against brother that we should bring with us, it's this. We do not repeat our mistakes.